we'll do today, we will look at the equilibrium in the macroeconomy. What I want you to think of this lecture is how you would think with microeconomics when we had demand and supply. But rather than looking at the demand curve for one product, we're looking at the aggregate economy. So we're looking at the aggregate demand, which comes from all sectors. So it comes from households, firms, government, and the outside world. So we're looking at the aggregate demand. The same thing with aggregate supply. So this is what all firms produce, which means we're looking at the real GDP. So when we plot the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, we have the same in a very similar way, the same way we had with the macroeconomics. We would have quantity on the horizontal axis and prices on the vertical axis. But today, because we talk about the aggregate economy, so what we'll have is the quantity is just real GDP, so that's all what we produce. The price is not going to be a price for a particular product. It's going to be the general level of prices in this country or in this economy. So it's going to be the price level. Okay, and we already covered before how we measure the price level in an economy. So, and the equilibrium will be the if we know the aggregate demand, the aggregate supply, then the equilibrium will be where these two intersect with each other. That would be the equilibrium point. Okay, and the equilibrium outcome at that point will be the real GDP and the price level. So that's what we look at. The only difference, as you will see now, with the supply side, we will distinguish between two time frames, so which we didn't do with microeconomics when we look at demand and supply. So we will look at the short run equilibrium and the long run equilibrium, because we'll have two supply curves, aggregate supply curves. So in the short run and in the long run. So everything else is very, very similar. So for example, moving along the same curve will happen when the price change. But shifting the curve, then that means something else has changed. So you need to understand, you need to know what factors will shift the long run aggregate supply and what factors will shift the short run aggregate supply. Remember, we make this distinction now. We have long run and short run aggregate supply. And also we need to learn the factors that will change the long run aggregate demand. So which means what factors would shift that curve to the right or to the left. So that's pretty much everything we'll cover today. So let's go through this one by one then. So let's look at the supply side. So with the supply side, as I said, we have quantity and price, but the supply in an economy means the real GDP, so all the output we produce. So that means the quantity supplied, this will be the quantity of real GDP. Okay, remember, we're not looking at one good or one product. We're looking at everything we produce in an economy. So the quantity of real GDP supplied will be the total quantity that firms plan to produce during a given period. So that's the aggregate supply then. So the aggregate supply is a relationship between quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. So real GDP and the price level. Just think of these as Q and P, the quantity and the price, the same way. So we have the real GDP as the quantity and the price level, that's the price. And as I said, we make this distinction. We distinguish between two time frames. One is the long run aggregate supply, and know this now, LAS, long run aggregate supply, and the short run aggregate supply. So with the long run aggregate supply, the relationship between real GDP and the price level, when the real GDP is at its potential, or they equal the potential GDP. So in the long run, the aggregate supply, or the long run aggregate supply, will be the real GDP when the real GDP equal the potential. Remember, the potential GDP is the full capacity for any economy. So at that point, we have full employment level. The unemployment that exists at that point will be the natural unemployment rate, which is the sum of the fractional and the structural unemployment rates. That's what we covered before. So that's what we know. So at that point, the potential GDP will have full employment, all resources are fully employed, and that is the full capacity for the economy. So that happened in the long run. So in the long run, the long run aggregate supply at that point is not dependent on the price, so it does not change when the price change, and that's why the long run aggregate supply will be a vertical line. So it's going to be vertical at the potential GDP. So that's going to be the vertical line. So that's the long run. So what about the short run? So in the short run aggregate supply is the relationship between real GDP supplied and the price level when the money wage rate, so remember this now, this is very important, the money wage rate and other the prices of other resources and potential GDP remain constant. So in that case, when if we have a rise in the price level and the money wage rate doesn't change, then this will increase the real GDP. So that's why we will have the short run aggregate supply slope upwards, the same way we would see any supply curve. So it's upward sloping. So let's see this. So that's the long run aggregate supply. So let's see what we have. On the vertical axis, we measure the price level, and on the horizontal axis, we measure the real GDP. Okay, and the long run aggregate supply is a vertical line. Why? This curve is vertical because it does not depend on the price level. So that's why you see a vertical line. So this, and it's at the potential GDP. And again, this is the long run aggregate supply. And the short run aggregate supply is just upward slope curve, like as we said. So you see, so that is the short run aggregate supply. Remember, as I say, it's very important to understand how the money wage rate adjusts. So in the short run, the money wage rate is not changing, it's constant, it's very sticky, so it doesn't respond very quickly. So it takes time until it adjusts. In the long run, the change, if the price level change, the money wage rate will change by the same percentage. That's why we have a vertical line. So that's why the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical. But in the short run, because the money wage rate is constant, so it doesn't change, if we have an increase in the price level, this will encourage firms to increase GDP. So that means if the price increase, the real GDP will increase. So that's why we have this upward slope curve. So in the short run. So in the long run, because in the long run the money wage would adjust, we'll have enough time to adjust. That's why we'll see this vertical line. And in the short run, it does not happen. It doesn't change the money wage rate. That's why we'll have the upward slope curve for the supply, or for the short run aggregate supply curve. So as we see here, so this point C is just could be any point on the short run aggregate supply, but at that point, if as I said, if prices increased, so if the price level increased, this will encourage firms to produce more. That's why we'll move this in this direction on the short run aggregate supply curve. If the price level was were below 110, then we'll be moving the other direction on the short run aggregate supply curve this way. So if the price below 110, that means we have a recession, or the real GDP we have is below the potential GDP. So anywhere before C, let's say point A or B, that means the real GDP is below the potential, because now we understand that the potential here is 16, and 16 here, this is the where the long run aggregate supply is. So these 2 points, A and B, means that the price level is below 110, and the real GDP we have is below the potential GDP. Okay, so of course, if we at any point, or the price level is above 110, so that means we'll be moving in this direction, D or E, and in that case, the real GDP will be above the potential GDP. So as I said, so it's very important to understand how we move on the same curve and what would shift the whole curve. So that's what we did in microeconomics when we explained supply curve. We said if the price change, will move along the same curve, but if any other factor that we assumed to be a constant change, that will shift the entire curve. So the same case here, we want to understand what would shift, or what would cause a change in the aggregate supply. And because here we have, it's okay, it's fine. So well, it's more interesting than what we're doing here, I know. I understand. Don't worry. Okay, so let's get back to the lecture, please. So what we want to know now is what would shift the supply curve. Okay, but now we have two curves: the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. So we have two curves. So first of all, let's look at the the long run aggregate supply. Sorry. So the long run aggregate supply is determined by the potential GDP. Then if the potential GDP change, if the potential GDP increased, that should shift the long run aggregate supply to the right. So what would change the potential GDP? Does anyone know? How does the potential GDP increase? We did this last week when we talk about economic growth. You remember when we defined economic growth? That was this sustained increase or rise in the potential GDP. So does anyone remember what factors would change the potential GDP? Go back to the previous lecture from last week. Okay? So anyway, so if anything happened, change the potential GDP, then this will affect the long run aggregate supply. So the long run aggregate supply will shift to the right if potential GDP increased. And also if the money wage rate, which we assume to be constant, change, this will cause a shift in the aggregate supply. But we will see now which curve will be affected by this. It will be the short run aggregate supply curve. So as we said, or as we covered in the previous lecture last week, the potential GDP can change if one of these change. So if we change labor supply, which means if we have an increase in the full employment quantity of labor, or if we have an increase in labor productivity, which means one of these two. An increase in the quantity of capital would increase labor productivity, or if we have an advanced technology, this will increase labor productivity. So the last 2 points here related to labor productivity, that's what we covered in the last lecture. And the first reason here, which is an increase in the full employment quantity of labor, that's related to the supply of labor. So if labor supply increased or labor productivity increased, this will increase the potential GDP. Okay, and if that happened, so if the potential GDP increased, this will shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, and also will affect the short-run aggregate supply. So this will move both together. So if the potential GDP increased, that will shift the long-run aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. So that's the situation we have. So this is the initial point, equilibrium, or we don't have an equilibrium yet, but this is the position of the long-run aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate supply curves. Then if for any reason, as I said, one of the reasons that we mentioned now has changed, this or has increased, this will result in increasing potential GDP, and this will affect or will shift both curves to the right. So the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift from long-run aggregate supply 0 to 1. So we'll have right shift, and the same thing will happen to the short-run aggregate supply. It will shift to the right. So that's the first factor. Again, if potential GDP increased. So as I said in the beginning of the lecture, you need to know what would shift. What can cause the shift in these curves? So first we're looking at the supply curve. So what can shift the supply curve, the long run or the aggregate supply curve? Potential GDP would shift both the long run and the short run aggregate supply curves. But the money wage rate will affect only the short run aggregate supply. Okay, so if for example we have a rise in WW, here is the money wage rate. If wage increase, this will shift the supply, the short run aggregate supply curve to the left. Just think of this as the same way we did it with microeconomics. So in microeconomics, we would think of wage as a cost for firm. So that's why it will shift the supply curve to the left, which means if wages increase, that means firms will supply less because it's going to be more costly to them. So again, but the difference here is very important. The long run aggregate supply curve is not going to change. If the money wage rate change, if the money wage rate increased, as you see, what happened here is the short run aggregate supply shift to the left, but the long run aggregate supply curve didn't move. Okay? So is this clear now? So in the short run, we assume that the money wage rate is constant. So that's why if it change, this will shift the short run aggregate supply. In the long run, it depends on the potential GDP, and if the potential GDP change, this will shift both curves, the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. So that's the supply side. And as I said, if you want to understand equilibrium in the macroeconomy, you need to look at both demand and supply. And again, we're not looking at one product now, we're not looking at one market, we're looking at the whole economy. So that's why we look at the aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So as we said, the aggregate supply is a relationship between the price level and the real GDP. And we made this, we distinguish between the two time frames, the long run and the short run. With the aggregate demand, we'll have only one curve, so we'll have the aggregate demand curve, and again it will tell us the demand that's coming from all sectors. And we, before we mention these 4 sectors, households, firms, government, and the outside world. So household, they spend on goods and services, so they do consumption, expenditure. The firms do investment, government does the government spending, and the outside world is the net export, which is X minus M. So this is the same we did before. So what we want to do now, we want to look at how the aggregate demand will look like and what would shift the demand, the aggregate demand curve. Okay? So these are the factors that will determine the plans coming from all these sectors to buy goods and services. So price level, expectations, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and the world economy. So let's look at how the aggregate demand curve looks like. So the aggregate demand curve is the relationship between real GDP demanded and the price level. The curve will explain this relationship, and it will be downward slope demand curve like any other demand curve that we would expect. So that's how it looks like. If you look at the horizontal axis, you'll see real GDP. The vertical axis, we have the price level, and it's downward slope curve. Why? Because there are 2 reasons to explain this. One is the wealth effect, the first one. The other one is the substitution effects. There are 2 reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward slope curve. So the first reason, So the first reason is the wealth effect. If the price level increased, and assuming that other things are the same, so they didn't change, this will decrease the quantity of real wealth. And to restore this, people would increase their saving and decrease their spending. So this is negative relationship. So the price increased, and their spending, they spend less because they want to restore the same level of wealth, so by saving more. The other reason is the substitution effect. And the substitution effect, actually there are 2 effects. One is the intertemporal substitution effect, and this happened through the effect on the interest rate. So if the price level increase, for example, and again assuming that other factors remain the same, this will decrease the real value of money and raises interest rate. When interest rate increased, then people will borrow and spend less, and this again will decrease their demand, or the real GDP demanded will decrease. So what we're trying to do here, we're trying to explain why this demand curve is a downward slope demand curve, or why there is negative relationship between the price level and the real GDP, or the quantity of real GDP demanded. So as we said, the first reason is the wealth effect. The second reason is the substitution effects. Substitution effects, the first one is the intertemporal substitution effect, and as I said, this happened through the effect on the interest rate. And the second one, which is the international substitution effect, and this means when the price level increased, and again we'll assume that any or other factors remain the same, they don't change, this will increase the price of domestic products compared to foreign products. So how this going to, or what is the impact on the aggregate demand? Of course, if the domestic products are relatively more expensive compared to foreign products, then people or imports will increase, because now it is cheaper to buy these products from abroad. So when we have imports increased, and exports would decrease, because foreigners will not buy the same, because now our products are relatively more expensive compared to buying from somewhere else. So, and both these factors will lead to a decrease in the real GDP. So the real GDP demanded will decrease. So that's the other reason. So again, why the aggregate demand look like the demand curve or the downward slope demand curve? These are the two reasons: wealthy effect and substitution effects. The substitution effects has two effects. So the intertemporal effect, which happened through the impact on the interest rates, and the international substitution effect, which happened when the comparing the domestic prices by the foreign prices, and that impact happened through the change in the exports and imports. So these are the reasons why we have a downward slope aggregate demand curve. What is more important than this is to know what would shift this curve to the right or to the left. And why we would do this? Because we want to know what if one of these factors change, how this is going to affect the equilibrium. So remember, the equilibrium will be the intersection between the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, and this will determine the real GDP and the price level. Okay, so if one of these factors change, this will shift the aggregate demand, and this will result in a new equilibrium point. So let's first look at the change in the aggregate demand. What would change the aggregate demand? So as we said, the expectations, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and the third factor would be the world economy. So we'll look at each one of those in more detail. So let's look at the first one, expectations. If people expect that let's say there will be an increase in future income, or there will be an increase in the future inflation, so inflation or the prices will increase in the future, this means they will demand more now. So this will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So expectations here are related to either future income, future inflation, and also future profits. So if we expect that there will be an increase in one of these, that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So if people expect that their income will increase in the future, they might increase their consumption now. And remember, consumption here is one of the components in the aggregate demand. Do you remember what are these components? Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. You have to remember those. Okay? So again, so if you want to understand how the aggregate demand change, you need to understand what are the components. Okay? So the aggregate demand is the demand coming from households, firms, government, and the outside world. So that means the aggregate demand is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, which is X minus M, exports minus imports. Okay, so if people expect that their income will increase in the future, that means they will consume more now. They'll spend more in consumption now. And again, this is one of the components of the aggregate demand curve, so that's why it will shift to the right. So that means aggregate demand will increase. The same thing, if people if they expect that the prices will increase, so the future inflation now. So if you expect that the products will be more expensive next month, you'll buy more now. So this will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So this will increase aggregate demand, and so on. So that's one factor now. So expectations is one factor that can shift the aggregate demand curve. The other factor, which is the policy, fiscal or monetary policy. So now let's first ask, what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy, it is what the government does when they change tax rate or government spending to affect or to influence the economy. So when they do that, they remember G is part of the components here of the aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand is consumption, C plus I plus G. So G here, that's what the government does. So if they change taxes or government spending, this will have an impact on the aggregate demand. So let's say if they spend more, so if they increase G, then we would expect that the aggregate demand will increase. So the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Okay? If they increase taxes, so the tax here affect the disposable income. So disposable income is the after tax income, which means this is your income after you pay the tax. So if the government increase the tax rate, that means you'll be paying more tax and you will be left with less disposable income. How this is going to affect the aggregate demand is going to affect the aggregate demand through the impact on the consumption. Okay, so that means how households will have less money to spend on consumption, and that means the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Okay, so that's fiscal policy. So fiscal policy, it's the government's attempt to influence the economy by setting and changing taxes or purchasing goods and services. So that's G and T. So T here's taxes, G is the government spending. So if you have a tax cut, for example, or they increase the transfer payments, this will increase the household's disposable income. So that's where the link comes from. Then people will have more money. Just remember, this is the case when the government has a tax cut. So that means people will have more income to spend. So now there's more money available to be spent on consumption. And this will increase the aggregate demand. So that means the aggregate demand will shift to the right. So the same thing would happen, or similar impact would happen, if the government changed G. G here is the government expenditure. So if they decide to increase what they spend in the economy, this means the aggregate demand will shift to the right. Okay? So remember, because G, one of the components of the aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, X minus M. Okay, so that's one of the reasons, or one of the factors that can affect or change the aggregate demand. So the next point, or the next factor, which is monetary policy. So monetary policy here, when the central bank try to change the money supply or the interest rate, and this again, this will have an impact on the aggregate demand, which will cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So the central banks attempt to influence the economy by changing the interest rate and adjusting the quantity of money. That is monetary policy. And if they increase money supply, so if the quantity of money increased, that means people have more money, okay? And this will increase the aggregate demand. So people will want more, so they will demand more. That will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So if we have a cut in, if the central bank cut the interest rate, again, this means people will have more they will increase expenditure, and this will increase the aggregate demand. So that's so let's just go back to the main point. So what we're looking at here is that what factors or what determinants will change the aggregate demand. Change the aggregate demand here means the aggregate demand will shift either to the right or to the left. So we looked at expectations and policy here. We looked at fiscal and monetary policy. The third factor is the world economy. How does the world economy influence the aggregate demand? So this happened through two ways. So if there is a fall in the foreign exchange rate, that means the domestic products will be relatively cheaper compared to the foreign products. So again, if there is a drop or a fall in the exchange rate, that means the domestic product will be relatively cheaper, and this will increase export and decrease imports. So X minus M is part. This is one of the components that we have in the aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So if there's a fall in the exchange rate, that will make our products cheaper than the foreign products, which means our exports will increase and imports will decrease, and this will shift the aggregate demand to the right. So, or if foreigners now become richer, they have an increase in their income, this again will increase their demand on our products, which means the aggregate demand will shift to the right. So now hopefully we understand what factors would shift the aggregate demand or would cause a change in the aggregate demand, and what factor would cause the change in the aggregate supply. So to sum up the whole idea, so with the aggregate supply, we have the long run aggregate supply, and this is determined by the potential GDP. So this is where the potential GDP is. And we have the short run aggregate supply. That's why you have, with the long run aggregate supply, you have a vertical curve. So with the short run aggregate supply, it's just a very usual supply curve. So it is upward sloped supply curve. And if the two factors that would cause a change in the aggregate supply is the change in potential GDP, and potential GDP would change both, will shift both. Will shift the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. Okay? But if the money wage rate change, this will affect only the short run aggregate supply. So the short run aggregate supply will shift to the left if the money wage rate increased. If the money wage rate decreased, so that means the short run aggregate supply will shift to the right. With the demand, with the aggregate demand, we know that there are three factors: expectations, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and the world economy. And that's what you need for the assignment. In question 3, if given that you know the equilibrium, which we'll cover now, which is the intersection between these two, then you need to think of which curve, is it the aggregate supply or the aggregate demand, will be affected by what is given the question. Is it going to affect the aggregate supply or the aggregate demand? And then you will have a new equilibrium point. So let's just now go to the idea now. So again, the aggregate demand will shift to the right if the aggregate demand increased, and shift to the left if the aggregate demand decreased. Sorry. Yeah. So now let's look at the equilibrium now. So we'll have 2 points to think of, or 2 equilibrium points. So the short run and the long run, because we have a short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply. So looking at the short run macroeconomic equilibrium, and that's the first question, that's the first point in question 3. To ask you to draw the short run macroeconomic equilibrium. So this will be the intersection point between the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. Just very simple. So this is how it is. So that's the short-run aggregate supply. That's the aggregate demand curve. And this is the equilibrium point. So you can tell how much is the real GDP at that point and how much is the price level. Okay. So again, so the short-run equilibrium, where it happens when where the aggregate demand curve intersects or cuts the short-run aggregate supply curve. So you'll see this is the equilibrium point, and yeah, that's the equilibrium point. So we have 110, that's the price level, and the real GDP is 16. So that is the equilibrium at this point. So this equilibrium point can be anywhere. So it could be before potential GDP, or exactly at the potential GDP, or above the potential GDP. So the equilibrium in the short run can happen anywhere, before or at or after the potential GDP. Okay? But in the long run, the long run equilibrium will happen when the aggregate demand cut the long run aggregate supply curve. So we're looking at the long run now. So remember, the long run aggregate supply curve here is vertical, and it is where the real GDP equals the potential GDP. So here, this is the long run aggregate supply. This is the black dots here. This is the intersection between the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply, which means this is the equilibrium in the short run. Okay, so this is the short run equilibrium, and in this example you see it happened before the potential GDP. Okay, so this is below the potential GDP level. The potential GDP level here is denoted by this long run aggregate supply. So we agreed before that because the long run aggregate supply does not depend on the price level, that's why it takes this vertical curve, and 16 here should be the potential GDP. So the question now, so this is where is the long run equilibrium then? So if this is the short run equilibrium, where is the long run equilibrium? So remember, the long run equilibrium is where the aggregate demand cuts the long run aggregate supply curve. Yeah, so this should be here, this point should be the long run equilibrium. Okay, so if this was the situation in the short run, okay, then there must be something will happen until we go to this point. We'll move to the equilibrium in the long run. So that's the situation we have here. Because this is the black dot here, this is the equilibrium in the short run. This one, the red one here, this is the equilibrium in the long run. And what happened in this situation, you will see that the money wage rate, and as I said, the money wage rate affects the short run aggregate supply. This will shift, so the money wage rate will fall, and this will shift the supply curve in the short run aggregate supply curve to the right until we come to this point. So this point here is the long run equilibrium. And what you see now is the adjustment, how we reach to that point. So if, for example, equilibrium happened before that point, before the potential GDP, we know that this is the long run equilibrium point where the aggregate demand cuts the long run aggregate supply. So that is the long run macroeconomic equilibrium. And in this situation, because the equilibrium happened before, at this point, this black dot here, and as I said, the money wage rate, or the wages are sticky, and it takes time until it adjusts, but in the long run it will adjust until we go back to the equilibrium here. So in this case, the money wage rate will fall, and this will cause the short run aggregate supply will shift to the right until we come to the until we reach the long run equilibrium points. And again, that's what we need for question 3. So question 3 is very simple. So in the assignment, so just tell you this is the equilibrium, draw that, show the equilibrium, use the graph, show the equilibrium, and then it asks you what would happen if something changed, and it asks you about the short run and the long run. So all what we again, just to sum up the main idea of the macroeconomic equilibrium. So it is where the intersection happens between the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand. But because we have two curves for the aggregate supply, so we have the long run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate supply. So we make this distinction. We have two equilibrium points, one in the short run, so this is the intersection between the aggregate demand and the short run aggregate supply, and one in the long run, which is the intersection between the aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply. Okay, so as I said, the short run equilibrium can happen anywhere. So it can happen before, this is the example we have, it's before the potential, so this is below the potential GDP, and or could happen at the potential GDP level, or it can happen above this or beyond this level. So the example we have here show you how we're going to move from the short run equilibrium point, which happened to be before the potential GDP, how we're going to move to the long run equilibrium, which is at the potential GDP. In this particular case here, the money wage rate will fall, and this will cause a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve to the right until we come or we reach to this point where you'll see this is the equilibrium in the long run. Okay, so the black dot here, this is the short run equilibrium. The red one show you the long run equilibrium in this economy. So this case now, as I said before, the short run equilibrium can happen anywhere. In this case, we'll see the intersection between the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves. This happened above or beyond the potential GDP. Okay, so where is the long run equilibrium? Where is the long run equilibrium? Does anyone know? So again, it's the intersection between, yeah, so it's the aggregate demand and the long run aggregate supply. So basically this should be the long run equilibrium, should be here. So as I said, the short run equilibrium can happen anywhere. Can happen before or at exactly the potential, or beyond or above the potential. So in our case here, you see, in this case, initially the economy has the short run equilibrium above the full employment. And this case, again, the money wage will adjust. And the reason is, as I said, money wages are sticky, so they don't change in the short run. But in the long run, they have enough time to adjust. And when they do, they take us back to the long run equilibrium. So in our case here, the equilibrium happened above the full employment or the potential GDP level. And in that case, we'll see that the money wage will rise, and this will shift the short run aggregate supply curve to the left until we come to the equilibrium point in the long run, which is the red one. Okay, so this show you or explain the adjustment or how it happened. And remember, in these two cases now, it happened that the short run equilibrium didn't match or didn't happen at the potential GDP. And the adjustment here happened through the change in the money wage. That's why I say just notice what is happening to the money wage rate, because that explains to you how the adjustment happened in the long run. So in the short run, we assume that the money wage rate is constant, doesn't change, or is sticky. That's why it takes time, and it needs time to adjust, needs time to respond. And when it does, it takes us back to the long run equilibrium state or case. Okay, so I'll stop at this point. We'll take a break.